Good afternoon, everyone. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority acknowledges the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today, the Woolgooroo Kabar and the Bindal people, and the traditional owners across the entire length of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and for anyone who's joining us at home through the webinar. So welcome everyone today. This session is about how science is important to us, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. My name's Jessica Hoey. I'm the Director of Synthesis and Reporting, and today joining me is Dr. Mark Reid.
Hey everyone.
And Dr. James Carey.
Hi there.
So to kick things off, Mark and James, can you tell us what you do at the Marine Park Authority?
Absolutely, Jess. So I'm what's called the Assistant Director of Reef Conservation Actions, which is a little bit of an eclectic portfolio of sort of strategic and policy direction for the management of islands, marine habitats and vulnerable species, plus a really nice mix of hand-on activities as well. So I still have the opportunity to go out there and work on islands, work with things like marine turtles and birds, but more importantly work with our partners in the Reef Joint Field Management Program, Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service.
Thank you. James?
Yeah, so I'm Assistant Director of Strategy, which a bit like Mark is kind of a broad portfolio. So I work on the parliamentary side of what we do, so that's our communication with the Minister's Office, but also the work that we do responding to, say, the Senate or to parliamentarians. I'm also responsible for elements of the governance of the authority, so the work we do with our board and our executive. We have an important relationship with the Great Barrier Reef the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, which, as you may know, is managing a large sum of money in relation to reef activities at present. And the final thing that I have responsibility for is... Can't remember, sorry.
That's all right.
Back to you.
You'll think of it
It's
later.
quite a lot.
Yeah. So, given that, I mean, you know, we're all here in different roles, but one thing that we do have in common is we did have come through university doing a marine science or a science background. And I think one important thing that we do really want to try and communicate today in this webinar is how we got into science, share some of our science stories that, you know, many people might not know. And so, Mark, tell us a little bit about how you got into science and what you actually studied.
Okay, Jess and everybody. So I got to say, I was one of those horribly precocious children that I caught my first snake at 5 years old, and then just developed a real interest in reptiles in particular. So I think I drove my parents a little bit crazy with the various antics of bringing things home and, you know, climbing trees to pull down goannas and those sorts of things. So from a really young age, I wanted to be a ranger. To me, that was, you know, the penultimate job, to be able to work out on country, work with sort of natural ecosystems and animals, and work with people to try and achieve some good goals. So through school, I did biology, really interested in the study of animals, and then when I went to university, I did a zoology degree to start with, and really focused in on animals and venomous animals, parasitology. I did a real strange mix of things. I then did an honours degree, so that's the next degree up, and I spent a year studying the feeding ecology of juvenile green turtles. So I was out on Moreton Bay 3 to 4 days a week catching turtles, tagging turtles, flushing their stomachs so I could actually get their stomach contents and study it and, you know, see what they've been feeding on. So that was really cool because a lot of my lab mates were doing really awful things in terms of grinding up corals and studying corals and all that sort of stuff, and I was out on boats catching turtles. And then I was really still interested on how animals used food to do, you know, various parts of their life history. And so I then did a PhD looking at the nutritional physiology of juvenile crocodiles. And I did that on a crocodile farm. So what I was doing is that I was making up a diet that had specific elements in it to try and test how the crocodiles would change their growth patterns. And then I was force feeding the crocodiles, up to 70 crocodiles a day for 2 months, so I could get really precise recordings on how they actually grew according, you know, based on the diets.
Right.
And so, you know, for a young scientist, that was a really interesting time of my life. And it was, for me, it was great because it led me to get a job as a crocodile biologist working for the Queensland government. And that was my first proper job.
Yeah. And thankfully you don't have many interactions with crocodiles now in your job.
Well, I've got to say, it's interesting. People often think about animals like that as being really dangerous and difficult to work with. If you've got good people, good procedures, and you know what you're doing, they're actually remarkably safe to work with. They're like anything else. If you push the boundaries and do crazy things and make mistakes, you'll pay for them. If you know what you're doing, you've got good people around you, well trained. They're probably actually, I'd much rather catch a 5-minute crocodile than a feral cat.
Okay.
The crocodile's far easier to handle.
Thanks, Mark. So James, different tact. So he was talking about the working with boring corals, not boring corals, but grinding up corals. So
Well, Mark didn't do that.
no, but others.
No.
So with your PhD, you were like taking renovation to a new level and creating these weird mushroom-shaped things underwater. What was your PhD about?
Sure. So before I answer that, I just want to say that I have remembered the fourth thing that I do, which is corporate planning. And if Nicole's watching this in my team, I apologise for getting that important done. So going back to the PhD, we've got a couple of pictures here. This is actually my master's, so I only ever intended to spend, you can probably hear that I'm not Australian or wasn't when I arrived. I only intended to spend 18 months here doing a master's degree. And for my master's degree, I did some research looking at whether fish particularly care what kind of structure is giving them shade on the reef. So we see big fish, like this is a trout, and we see them hiding under table corals, which are like these plate shapes that you see out on the reef. So we just tried putting down these sort of plastic structures that imitated those shapes and seeing if the fish used them. And we had two different types. So the one that you can see there is actually painted black. So it provides a shade, whereas we also had, and we would clean them regularly so they didn't get encrusted with algae, we had see-through lids as well. And the fish ignored the see-through structures. I haven't got a picture of that, but this is another one which is painted black, and you can see that huge coral trout, that's probably 60, 70 centimeters, has actually wedged itself in under there. So we found a really strong response to that provision of shade on the reef, which suggests that's a really important function for fish out on the reef.
Yeah, because people often think, corals are just, while they're important structures, they're there, they're beautiful, they're important for the small fish and things like that, but not many people would actually think they also provide shade for your big fish that people actually care about having on their dinner plate and things like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I don't know if we can bring up the photo where you can see a sort of day and night juxtaposed. It's the next one, I think. Yeah, okay. So it's not great quality. I'm sorry, I had to pull this off of a GoPro video, but you can see about 50 fish under that coral. That's a huge coral over about 2 meters in length that was at Lizard Island, and this is middle of the day, that top shot, and you can see so many fish crammed under there. So we think what they're doing is actually saving energy by hiding from the UV, because they have to produce compounds that protect them from UV irradiance. So they're potentially getting an energetic benefit by hiding there during the day. That bottom shot, you can see at night time, there's really no fish under there. Some of them have gone off to hunt, but there's obviously not that UV factor as you're approaching dusk. So potentially that's explaining why they are where they are. And I'd just make one other comment, which is that we actually lost that coral in the 2016 bleaching event, which was really quite sad.
So likewise to both of you, I studied marine science as well, and my focus, I went through to honours, was actually looking at how important depth is to fish and their life history traits. So the way I liken it is Mount Everest. If you think of Mount Everest, which is above the water, the higher you get on a mountain and Mount Everest, the harder it is to live. Okay, things just get more challenging. It's like that under the water with depth. Okay, so I looked at a fish, a little jobby, a little pomocentrid, and this species basically lived all the way right up in the shallows at 2 meters, all the way down past 50 meters. And so what I was looking at is I was collecting these fish from different areas, and they stayed in their spot once they found a place to live. and tried to compare if the ones in the shallows were having the same size babies, you know, the same fat stores as those that lived in the deep, and they were, you know, very different. So that was the focus of my research. And when I finished uni and my honours, I didn't actually want to continue on with a PhD. I did want to move into management, and so that's where I am now.
So here you are.
Here I am, that's right. So given that, and given all of your experience, you know, working on reefs and different habitats over the time, what's one piece of practical advice that you would give to someone starting out who are looking to get into a science degree?
I'm going to say, Jess, from my perspective, the one bit of practical advice I'd give people listening in today is volunteering.
Yeah.
I found that I started doing volunteering quite early, which meant that I got to meet people that were active in the science field. So I got to sort of learn, you know, be mentored by those people. But it also meant that you got to understand how science was being applied in different things. So I actually volunteered at the Queensland Museum for 3 years while I was doing my undergraduate degree. And so one day a week I'd work in the museum, and it just changed the way I looked at both the application of science, but also what I was interested in terms of following up on my career. And for me, there was some really, you know, there was some very, very tangible benefits, because I then got to meet Dr. Cole Limpus, who's a marine turtle authority, internationally respected turtle biologist. And then I actually did my honours degree through Cole because I'd done the volunteering. So that'd certainly be my piece of advice to people listening in, is think about the things you're interested in and see whether or not there's opportunities to volunteer, because you can then start to build that network. And for me, once again, this sort of really paid off, because when I was interviewed for my first proper job as a crocodile biologist, Cole Limpus was actually sitting on the other side of the table as one of the interview panel members. So he knew what I was capable of doing. So for me, it's volunteering.
Yeah, thanks. What about you, James?
Yeah, I think the volunteering advice is really good. I'd like to answer this two ways, if I may.
Okay.
So quick one regarding particularly science. I would say if you're thinking about doing a PhD particularly, make sure you love what you're doing, because it is a long, hard slog, and you're going to have some downtimes where you need that motivation to get you through. I just wanted to talk about, if you're thinking more about a career maybe at Gabrumpa or an organisation like this. You know, we look at Gabrumpa, there are so many different capabilities that we need in this organisation. It's not just science, but having that blend of science and maybe something else can be super useful. So I actually have a politics background as well, and you might be interested in law or consultancy or something, and it's amazing how you can bring together that set of skills with, you know, the science, and really be quite effective in a particular role that will need that unique combination of skills that maybe not a lot of people will have.
I think my sort of one piece of advice adds on to that, because we were talking, I was talking to some students not long ago about, you know, the possibilities in marine science. Even if you went through and did a Bachelor of Science degree, it doesn't mean that you just have the one pathway to end up in a lab or in a boat or in the field, you know. Like, you could end up in a non-government organisation, a government conservation organisation or management organisation, teaching the tourism industry. That, you know, that the opportunities are endless. And so I think it's important for people to understand that the, you know, the science background doesn't just mean that you follow that one stream.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So before we move on to a different tact, keep it clean, but what is one of the most memorable moments, good or bad, that you know you've experienced undertaking science in your history?
I've got one that's probably a little bit more unusual than most, Jess, is that in 2001 I was doing a helicopter survey counting crocodiles, and we actually flew the helicopter into a power line and crashed the chopper. So I had a very unique experience on that day. So all of us were completely A-OK. We'd written the helicopter off. It was destroyed. And so it ended up with the three of us standing beside the helicopter on a sandbank in the middle of this river, scratching our heads, thinking, you know, how are we going to get out of this? So yeah, that's certainly
Memorable.
I think I guarantee it's one of the top 5 scary things you do not want to do in your life.
Yeah. Right. I can't beat that. James, can you beat that?
Well, no, I can't beat it. But, I have a question for you. Were there any crocodiles involved at that point? I'm picturing you standing on a sand quay in some river up north.
It was a river up north, and thankfully where we had eventually ended up, there were no crocodiles in that particular location, so we weren't at any additional risk of crocodiles following the...
Sort of out of the frying pan into the fire.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. My most memorable story is also helicopter related, but we didn't crash. We came close, I reckon. It's actually quite somber. It's during the 2016 coral bleaching event. So I've been involved in 3 surveys for 2016, 2017, and again this year for significant coral bleaching on the reef. That's actually a picture of us with a functional helicopter on a sand quay, myself and Professor Terry Hughes in 2016. So that's really timely because that picture was taken as part of 3 days of surveys that we did in that chopper, and we surveyed 500 reefs, and we only saw 3 reefs that didn't have any bleaching. And that was pretty confronting to fly for 3 days straight and see the scale of what happened in 2016 up north. So I won't forget that.
Yeah, mine unfortunately is not a happy story either, but I do remember following the grounding of the Shenyang in 2010 on Douglas Shoal in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. After that, Gabrumpa with partners sent divers to sort of inspect the damage and to collect information, and the moment will always stick in my mind where, you know, you drop to the bottom in your scuba gear and just sitting in the middle of that scar where the ship had moved across the reef and the coral and organisms had just been ground down to a fine powder. And it was just like when a grader goes through in the bush and you're just left with like a dirt road. So that will stick with me forever.
And it's interesting, Jess, because I was lucky enough to dive the same site in 2016 for another reason, and you could still see as clear as day that scar that the grounding of the ship had left on the top of the coral reef. You could just see the pulverised area of coral rubble. So, you know, I think that's really illustrative of some of the challenges that we face as marine park managers, but also why our science is so important, so we can actually make informed decisions about things like coral reef management, but also how do we manage the other users of the reef.
So thank you. We're going to take a little bit of a different tact now. So as part of managing the reef, as you've heard, we all have different roles, but one thing that is core to all of us is that information and science is critical to how we make decisions. For example, where we may send vessels for compliance or surveys, what permit conditions we may put on people following an event. And so with that in mind, if we do sort of start to talk a little bit about incident response, so if an event or an incident happens on the reef, what kind of things do each of us have a role in doing? So Mark, if I could start off with you, you know, we've heard that you have an interesting role. You're part of the Reef Conservation Actions team, you lead that team. So can you tell us what you do particularly when responding to events?
Yeah, Jess, so, and listeners, my main role is, I suppose I'm an interface between capturing information or analysing information about what's going on from a variety of different sources, and then think about how we might enhance that information capture using a variety of different partners. So I'm part of the Reef Joint Field Management Program, so Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service are our active partners in that field management program. So one of the roles I play is that I liaise very carefully with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, and I might be doing things like saying, you know, we've got a real information gap about coral bleaching in this particular part of the Great Barrier Reef. do you have a vessel that's going to be deployed in that area? If you do, can you please make sure that you've got a team on board who are capable of getting in the water and doing an assessment of the health of those reefs, that would then I would get that information and use that to fill my information gap. So in many ways it's a sort of it's a combination between operational readiness and that sort of developing that situational awareness, and then harnessing the capability of our partners to be able to fill in some of those gaps.
Okay. And with that in mind, James, what's your role in recently, I think is one of the most pertinent ones in responding to an event?
Yeah, so it's actually not classically part of the job that I have here, but because of, I guess, the experience that I had in my previous role at the Centre of Excellence, I also participated in the aerial surveys that we did of coral bleaching in 2020. I was the Gabrumpa observer. There's no actual bleaching in this photo, I just really like it.
It is a good photo.
It's a good photo. Thank you. That's the outer shelf, so it drops down to about 2,000 metres off the shelf there. So my role there is actually to sit in the aircraft. We've taken to using aeroplanes now, not in any relation to Mark's story, but basically we will score the reef as we fly over it for what the intensity of coral bleaching is at different parts of the reef, and we'll do that over a huge area, so we fly about 10,000 kilometres, so we get pretty good coverage of the reef. This is, as you can probably see, there's quite a lot of bleaching on this reef. This was in 2020 down in the south. So scenes like that are what we don't want to see, but of course it's important that where it's happening we do document.
Can I just ask you a question about this photo? Because many people, if they were in a plane flying to Cairns or whatever, might see something like this and see the white and think it's just sand, but it's not, is it?
No, it's not. So that's, you've got there, you can see a sort of outer reef flat, and then it starts to taper off to the left of the picture, and you can see the crest, and it's going down the slope. So most habitats, most if not all habitats on that reef look to me to be severely bleaching. It's difficult. So there is some sand visible around the margin of the island there. You can see that it does look slightly different to the coral bleaching. It's almost more of an intense, vivid white. It's that fluorescing that you get with the bleaching. But I mean, this picture's pretty grainy, but we fly very slowly. We fly as low as we are permitted to do, which is about 100 meters above sea level. So we can actually distinguish, to the trained eye, you can actually distinguish sand and bleaching quite easily. In fact, here you can even make out individual coral colonies in some portions of that photo. Yeah. Okay.
And so from my perspective, and it's okay if you do want to bring up the grading scale image. So as I said at the start, I'm the Director of Synthesis and Reporting, and one of our key roles for the Marine Park Authority is to actually look at the information out there, whether it be coral bleaching information or information on turtles, anything like that, we want to monitor the condition and trend of over time. And you're looking at the moment on your screens at it's called a grading table from our 2019 Outlook reports. We produce this report every 5 years. And basically it's a sort of a state of the reef report, but it does cover more than just corals. So when I say reef, I'm talking about all of the different habitats and species, main species groups, processes, but also heritage, which is really important, world heritage, Indigenous heritage, etc. And the kind of things that my team do, particularly after events, is to look at basically what the state of the things we were measuring are, and try to provide for government, for the public, information on basically how it went, how it's going, what condition it is in. Because we do know the Great Barrier Reef is really important to not only nationally but internationally. And so after events, people really do want evidence-based, clear information on basically what happened. And so that's the kind of closing the loop role that my team brings to event management. not happy event management, sadly. So thank you guys for sharing your thoughts on that. So before we do close off, I just wanted to check if we did have any questions that have come through from anyone online.
We do. We've got a couple of audience questions. So somebody's asked, who are some of the other people we work with?
Okay. So I guess I'll speak from my perspective, and then if you guys want to chime in. Some of the key partners, for example, if I talk about the Great Barrier Reef Marine Monitoring Program. So basically, for many years now, Gabrumpa has been coordinating an inshore monitoring program, which looks at the health of inshore corals, seagrass and water quality, and we don't do that alone. So we work with numerous partners, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, University of Queensland, Tropwater at JCU, and some others to basically help us ensure that the monitoring is done, to collect the water samples, to analyse those, and then provide the information to the public. So there's some of the key partners that I think are really worth mentioning for the marine monitoring program.
Yeah, and I'd probably just add on that, Jess, is that one of the things we always emphasise is that the marine park is so big that we actually don't have the capability to be everywhere all the time. So we rely on a lot of other people to help us out. I talked a little bit about our relationship with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service as a key partner. But we also work with other government agencies like Queensland Boating and Fisheries Patrol, the Queensland Police Service, Maritime Border Command is certainly one of the partners that we deal a lot with. And then another group that I've certainly worked with a lot in my business is traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef. One of the projects we work with is the Rain Island Recovery Project, and it's really about conserving turtles in that place called Rain Island. Traditional owners are an absolute integral critical partner with the delivery of that project, and I have got to tell you that some of the best moments I've had have been standing on country with a traditional owner elder talking about their connection to the country and what it means to them. So for me, they're some of the real critical partners that I would work and like to acknowledge.
Yeah, so I mentioned before, part of my role is our important relationship with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, who are managing the Reef Trust Partnership, which is a large fund that they're deploying through a number of different areas like crown and thorn starfish control, for example, monitoring and reporting, and trying to really innovate in those spaces as well. So we're trying to work with them to ensure that we get as much value as possible out of that money. We also work closely in my world with so the Commonwealth Government, particularly the Reef Division in the Department of the Environment, and we also work with the Office of the Great Barrier Reef from a Queensland Government perspective, and that's mostly about policy, but it's also about, particularly with the department, about how we're funding certain things, what the priorities are for the reef, to ensure that we are being good stewards of it.
Thank you.
We've got another
Anything else?
hard-hitting question from a school that's joined us.
Okay.
They'd like to know what your favourite reef creature is.
Oh, I need to think about this one. Do you guys want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can. I want to look something. Not the creature, I know that. So my favourite creature is the octopus, which if you've been out on the reef, you may have seen, and they are amazing at camouflaging. So they can basically change their shape and their colour instantaneously. And you see them moving through the reef, and as I say, they move over a certain type of coral, they might become spiky and red all of a sudden. So that's just amazing to watch. But what I really like about them is something they do where they collaborate with coral trout. So they'll do something where the coral trout will know where fish are that it wants to eat, that they want to eat. And it will make what we call a referential gesture. It will kind of poke its head at that structure, and then the octopus who's coming along with it will get all its tentacles and put them into that structure and actually push the fish out into the mouth of the coral trout. And it's a symbiotic relationship, so the octopus enables the trout to get the fish, but then the octopus gets some of the fish that are sort of the leftovers. So it's I've actually seen it, and it's really
that'd be
amazing.
so
Yeah,
good
that's
to see.
that's very cool.
Yeah. And you've seen it on the Great Barrier
I've
Reef?
seen it, yeah, up at Lizard Island. I've seen that
Right.
happen.
Okay.
That's
They work
awesome.
with moray eels as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did know of moray, I didn't know the octopus.
Yeah.
Mark?
I'd have to say it's the sea snakes actually, Jess.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really
Reptiles.
not
Going back to your
surprisingly.
snake days.
Going back to my snake days, but you know, for me, they're just a really interesting group of animals that we actually know very little about. They're often fairly cryptic. You know, they've developed these amazing venoms and venom delivery mechanisms, but also there's some of them that feed on nothing else but fish eggs. So, you know, you've got this really great diversity of animals, you know, some that are active hunters, you know, feeding on fish, all the way through to these that just simply eat fish eggs.
Yeah.
And as I say, for me, it's the fact that we know so little about them that's really, in many ways, is really appealing.
Yeah, they're still very data deficient in the Outlook report. So
Mm.
anyone that's doing research on sea snakes, please continue.
Absolutely.
My favourite, I would have to say, is the mantis shrimp. I just love the mantis shrimp, and for people that might not know, there's sort of two general types. So there's the clubbers, so they're basically like big meaty yabbies that live on the reef, and the clubbers basically have like punching boxing gloves, and they feed on hard-shelled organisms like crabs, hence they need the boxing glove. And the spearers, so they have really nasty-looking spears, and so they feed on the soft-bodied like fish and things like that. And I remember when I was doing my honours research in Papua New Guinea, and I was on this rubble bank collecting these little fish with my net and clove oil and whatnot, and I remember putting the net down, and my knuckle was right near like the opening of a mantis shrimp burrow, and I got this enormous whack on my knuckle from one of the boxing ones, the Gonodactylus, and I was just in so much pain because I'd covered over its burrow and it was trying to protect itself. But just have the most respect for them, and they're also amazingly like colourful as well, and have, I think it's the most complex eye of any animal in the animal kingdom, basically. So that's my favourite critter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's all we have time for, but thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone who has joined us online. We really do appreciate your time, and I think the takeaway message from today is, I mean, we love working at the Marine Park Authority, and we're here to make sure that the reef is there for future generations, and hopefully after today we've given everyone listening a little bit more information about the possibilities of marine science, but also the importance of it, because we need people coming through to do our jobs in the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.